The upgraded Sea Baby maritime drones successfully operated against the vessels. This was reported by Freedom Channel's sources in the security service. Both tankers sustained critical damage and have effectively been put out of operation. This will deal a significant blow to the transportation of Russian oil. The Security Service of Ukraine summed up and published a video which we are now watching together on our screens. These are sanctioned ships that the Russian Federation was trying to use to export, in defiance of the sanctions, petroleum products and attempted to profit from it. Sergey, how effective do you think this particular type of sanction really is?
Moreover, today the sanctions continued and one of the tankers was once again hit, this time by Sea Baby. This is being reported by Turkish media. This message literally just came in moments ago. That's why we see that monitoring sanctions is also necessary, and it is being carried out by the Security Service of Ukraine. Professionally, and I would even say impressively, because everyone should understand that what is punished, evil, must obviously be punished, let's say, to the fullest extent. That's why such sanctions continue. It should be said here that the sanctions imposed by the defense forces, in particular the Security Service of Ukraine, the Navy, and the Armed Forces of Ukraine, are indeed, pardon the tautology, effective. That's the first point. Secondly, we're talking about the fact that our controllers, you see, their controlling stake in the form of our naval drones is simply astonishing, because the combat capabilities of these drones have been increased and their warheads have been enhanced. The video shows us just how significant the damage was. Most likely at least one of the tankers will sink. I hope the final shot I mentioned at the beginning will also be significant. And that this tanker will also be gone, because all violations, as we said, they must be stopped. These in fact are the most, let's say, proper sanctions and enforcement of sanctions that should be in place, especially in the Black Sea. As we can see, the battle for the Black Sea continues. For the Russian Shadow Fleet, this is a significant loss. We're talking about losses of tens of millions of dollars. And although it's said that these ships were not loaded, that they were only heading to the port of Novorossiysk, however, we understand. How much oil have they already transported? How much has Russia earned from these tankers, essentially for its economy, which today, as they say, is geared toward Russia's war against Ukraine? So everything is fine. I think there will be more to come.
Serhiy, I'm coming back to the words of the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. I'm talking about Kupiansk. Well, in fact, we know very well that the Russians are skilled at spreading lies. And many times they have claimed to have taken something, but in reality, the facts showed a completely different picture and story. Well, I want to ask about Kupiansk. Let me remind you that Syrskyi said that Ukrainian troops are continuing to clear the city, identifying any remaining Russians in order to eliminate or capture them. Syrskyi personally deployed troops in the Kharkiv region and gave additional instructions to the commanders. I want to ask you, or rather remind you to remind us, the significance, the key importance of Kupiansk. This is a target for the Russians, first of all, that they can't seem to take, despite throwing both forces and resources at it and making various attempts. But please remind us, I'll ask it plainly, why do the Russians want Kupiansk?
Well, basically, like all of Ukraine, they need it in order to establish their control, to change the very foundations of the system in our country. These are global issues. If we talk about the military significance of the city of Kupiansk and Kupiansk-Vuzlovy, which in my opinion are inseparable, we're talking about logistics. We're talking about the fact that if the Russian Federation scenario had been implemented, and such deadlines obviously existed, we remember when the Russians organized so-called flash mobs with flag planting in the center of Kupiansk. At that time, the point was that if the enemy continued to achieve such successes, they could make significant advances, particularly in the Kharkiv region, meaning they would already be moving into operational tactical space. In other words, it was about a broader front where the Russian army would probably have more advantages over Ukraine's defense forces. Today, we see that despite statements from citizen Gerasimov, who calls himself the chief of the general staff of the so-called armed forces of the Russian Federation, and accordingly, citizen Putin, who presents himself as the president of the so-called Russian Federation, it is obvious that the city is not just resisting. Today, the defense forces are truly meter by meter. It's hard combat work, reclaiming and clearing our territory in the city of Kupiansk from the Russian occupiers, disrupting their logistics and possible routes of movement accordingly. That is why we are saying that the enemy's logistics could have been reinforced, because we are talking about Kupiansk-Vuzlovy, which is a railway hub. As we all know well, Russian military logistics, their entire machine, is built primarily on the use of railway networks. Therefore, it is clear that the enemy tried to reach this operational tactical space as quickly as possible. Today, we clearly understand that all those cities, those large settlements that the enemy is attacking, are primarily important in terms of gaining access to operational tactical positions, to operational tactical space, in order to further advance across the entire territory of our country. Therefore, it is clear that cities like Lyman, Siversk, Kupiansk, Pokrovsk, Mirnohrad, and today also Farpost, Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, which are hardly mentioned these days. But why is that? Because that's where the Russians are being hit, and the Russians have nothing at all to boast about there. It is obvious that these places have become a kind of barrier today on the path of the Russian horde.
The Russian Federation continues its attacks on energy infrastructure and civilian residential areas, as practice shows. But what is Putin's real goal in carrying out these attacks? And we can see perfectly well, yes, the General Staff confirms that there are hits on energy infrastructure, but for the most part, especially with Shahed drones, the strikes are direct hits on residential areas, on apartment buildings. What is Putin's goal?
You know, we always tend to say, and it's absolutely true, that terror cannot be explained. Yes, terror is terror. And as far as I understand right now, at this very moment, there has been a strike in Odessa. We'll clarify the information after our meeting is over. And I'm more than certain that it was an attack on a civilian target or civilian infrastructure. That is why we say that the Russians are attacking civilian infrastructure, primarily energy and heating facilities. They are focused on a single goal to create dead zones in our territories, in our so-called rear, so that people are emotionally and psychologically crushed, so that people leave, so that people abandon the territory. Accordingly, in this way, the very foundation on which Ukrainian statehood is built, our citizens, our people, is being targeted, so that this foundation is simply eroded, so that this foundation is simply destroyed. That is why it is obvious that this Russian terror has specific objectives. People are supposed to freeze. And it is also clear that geopolitically, the Russians are counting on, as far as I know, at least this is the strategy that can be seen today, by January to reach a position where, in the opinion of the Russian occupiers, Ukraine will be most willing to negotiate. In other words, Ukraine will be ready to capitulate. I am sure that, as always, the Russian occupier is deceiving itself, and Ukraine will definitely continue to fight. Despite the difficulties we are facing today, lack of electricity, lack of heat, and most importantly and unfortunately, our losses, our people. And accordingly, we understand that these strikes are likely to continue for now. We need to be prepared for this. So we are talking about the deployment of our defense forces, about the deployment of our air defense.
Serhiy, with your permission, I would still like to ask you something. The draft peace plan that is being talked about so much today, which concerns, well, obviously, yes, and there are points regarding our armed forces. Yes, there have been certain changes there, yes, since those original 20. There were 9 points, but then it turned out there were already 19. Trump says 22. So for now, I don't even know the exact number of points. Could you tell us a bit about them? First of all, how do you perceive this peace plan project, the draft peace plan? I know that you communicate with military commanders. How do they, in general? I understand they're on the front lines, but still, there are certain discussions going on. How is this draft peace plan perceived?
We are not talking about a peace plan at all. In my view, this is a business project with specific names behind it. In particular, on the American side, there is a certain Mr. Witkoff, who is involved in his own business and political projects, and probably not only those. And in fact, the law enforcement agencies of the United States should probably be interested in what exactly the Russians promised Mr. Witkoff. Accordingly, on the Russian side, it's those who are in Putin's inner circle. That includes Dmitriev, Ushakov, and of course the Russian dictator himself. But this is the only way to assess what is being proposed to Ukraine. What is being offered to Ukraine is capitulation, which poses a threat to the very existence of the Ukrainian state. For us, this is probably a clear red line that no one will ever cross. There are communications, and the main thing in these communications should be a complete ceasefire. I'm not even mentioning that Russian troops must leave the territory of our country. Yes, let's be realistic. A complete ceasefire, and only then can we talk about continuing communications and accordingly about certain points of the so-called peace agreement. Of course, security guarantees. The main guarantee of security is our armed forces, our defense forces. We started with sanctions. Who is imposing which sanctions, how they are being monitored, and how they are actually being implemented? Well, as they say, we can take an example from the security service, from the armed forces. Sanctions involving firepower are not the most effective, in my opinion. Just like, for example, sanctions in the form of strikes by Ukrainian defense forces on the territory of the Russian Federation. After all, a lot is not actually covered in the media for various reasons. Not because the media isn't doing its job and the defense forces are working constantly, 24/7. I think that this very approach, strength on our part, will force the Russians to move to those positions they talk about. Ukraine's convenience for agreements, Ukraine's ability to negotiate. In particular, let's say that a certain stage will pass, and then we will be able to confidently say about Russia that, well, now the little fellow has ripened. Forgive me for such a free interpretation of what you're asking about.
And let's talk a bit more about the situation at the front. The Pokrovsk direction, again, is the most difficult. More than 50 clashes every day. This is also reported by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, among others. I will ask a question, perhaps radically, perhaps harshly, but this narrative is very often spread by Russian propaganda. It really grates on my ears. But still, from you, as a military man, from a person who is right there in the combat zone, Pokrovsk, is it a matter of time?
Pokrovsk is a demonstration that Ukraine, with a small army compared to the Russian one in terms of size, and above all, not in terms of skill, is capable of beating the so-called second army in the world. Pokrovsk, well, let's do it this way, the formation of our security guarantee. The Ukrainian army, oddly enough, probably, this may sound strange, but despite the losses, despite the difficulties, today we are forming exactly that security guarantee we talked about. The armed forces of Ukraine, the defense forces of Ukraine, are striking with quality and skill, not with numbers. And look at how powerful innovation and technology are on the battlefield. Today, the same Mirnorad, and we don't separate it from Pokrovsk. Who is working there with logistics? In many cases, it's robots doing the work. And today, people are repairing these robots, the ones that keep the Mirnorad defensive line, the Mirnorad garrison running day and night. This is Ukrainian skill. And the Russian military. Yes, some of them really do look like vagrants. Putin made a bit of a slip. He was talking about the wrong people. But nevertheless, the Russian army, which is also well supplied and has plenty of weapons, artillery, they still can't do anything. Let's remember, when was Pokrovsk supposed to be occupied according to the Russian Federation's plans? Last year. A year has passed. Where are the Russians now? Yes, they entered Pokrovsk, but we're there too, and the defensive operation continues.
A year and 3 months, Sergei. I keep count because
Pokrovsk, yes, to be exact, a year and 3 months.
this is indeed heroic resistance, heroic defense. Moreover, President Zelensky said at a meeting today that there was a meeting about a new stage of security and the strategy system was changing. Of course, we will talk about it in more detail when we have more information. It's very interesting to learn about this, and we want to thank you very much for joining us on the air. You're always welcome here.